and so why don't we just kick things off?
All right, just want to welcome the panelists tonight and the public that has joined us for our second of two Smith River planning meetings for the Smith River EA and our information on where we're going with the four major topics that we came out with for our revised Smith River plan that we're putting together. The original, the last plan we had was in 2009. It's time to update it. And through our discussions, we came up with four different topics, which was management of Camp Baker, human waste management, natural and cultural resources impacts, and then floater opportunity. I'll introduce myself. I'm Gary Bertolotti. I'm with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I'm the regional supervisor out of Great Falls. And we have a host of panelists here, including some of the advisory committee members. We have planners from FWP, fisheries from FWP, Park and Rec members from FWP, from Helena, and from the regional office here, including the Smith River Park Manager. And just want to welcome everybody here. Our purpose tonight is solely to provide information to you that are joining us so that you understand where we are, where we're going, the process in some detail with the four topics, and then allow you to ask questions to get clarification on anything that we present tonight. This is not a forum for public comment. We will get into that and where you can make public comment on this as we go through the presentation. But again, our purpose is to give you as much information as we can tonight so that you have the ability to understand where we're going and what we have on the table today. And any questions we can clear up is our purpose. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Dave Hagengruber, our information officer here in Region 4 out of Great Falls. And Dave, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Gary. I'm going to just quickly go through a little bit of the logistics for these. We've used this format, which is called a Zoom webinar, for some other things earlier this year, and it seemed to work. It's worked pretty well. So we don't, last week we had in the range of 25 people or so attend the first meeting, and we were able to get through all the questions that they had, and you know, plenty of back and forth discussion with some of their questions. So we are recording this one, and just like the first week, December 1st, we had our December 1st meeting. That one's available on our website. This one, hopefully by tomorrow or within a day or two, will also be available there. And we've had some people already comment that they've gone to the website, watched the video, and then submitted their public comments for that. So that's really my purpose, is to talk about how to make the comments and demonstrate that for you. And then also just to outline the way that we'll handle the questions and answers here at the end. We should have plenty of time for that. We did, like I said, we did last time. If there were, I saw there were a few people attending who are on the phone. If you're on the phone, you'll be muted, and you'll raise your hand, and we will, you'll press *9, and that'll raise your hand. That notifies us that you have a question, and then we'll try and recognize you. We'll call you out by name and say, okay, go ahead with your question. And then if you can unmute yourself, and on the phone, that is a *6 button should unmute you. For the rest of you who are on Zoom, there should be buttons along the bottom of your screen that just say to raise your hand, and then also to mute and unmute yourself. So that'll be our format for going back and forth and allowing you to ask your questions. And that's really, like Gary emphasized, that's the value of this. I think most importantly is this is a chance to hear from the parks planning people and the river manager and the regional parks manager, to ask them, you know, to hear their thoughts on this whole process, this planning process, and then to ask questions and be able to get a direct question and hopefully a real fast easy answer back in return to that. So to actually make the comments, when you want to, and we hope we get as many comments as we possibly can, you can either submit those in writing and mail that, and we'll show you the address there, or you can go to our website. And I'm going to share my screen, try and pull that down here and show you. The process is pretty simple and simpler than it is for me to share my screen, at least. If you go to submit a comment, if you go straight to the main FWP website page.
Hey, Dave, you jumped over to your email.
Oh, I should have, thank you. Put this back. I thought I was doing this the right way. There, we back up on screen now.
Yeah,
Yep,
you
that's
got it.
perfect, Dave. Thank you.
If you go to the main FWP webpage, which is fwp.mt.gov, takes you to the screen, at least lately. It's been the Lewis and Clark Caverns picture. Pretty easy to spot that one. You just scroll down that screen a little ways. You come to the series of big buttons across the bottom, and it's all the hunting regulations and muzzleloader hunts. And if you move over a little bit, you see right there is the Smith River State Park Environmental Assessment. And if you open up that page, this is probably where most of the people who are attending already have been there. That's where you got your login information for this Zoom meeting. If you run down that page a little ways, you'll see the 2009, the old management plan is there, along with the current environmental assessment for the 2021 plan. So you can actually download or read those documents right there. The two meetings come next. Right now we're on the December 7th. We don't have the December 1 up simply because that is a little bit confusing. But if you go, you can see the video, the link for that December 1st meeting. So if you haven't looked at that, you want to check that one out after tonight, that one is available there. But the important part, the public comments are the next item down. And there's a form right there that you can submit your comments really easily just online. You don't need to include your name, location, any of that other stuff if you don't want to, but you certainly encourage you to do that. And you can just type out your comment, and you can come back to this and you can alter your comment or do another comment. But what I'd stress is if you can outline in your comment, it makes it easier to tease the information out. If you can sort of denote in there that, well, this is, I'm talking about floater opportunity, and here's my thoughts on that, and here's my thoughts on waste management, and here, do it paragraph by paragraph, or just you can even do a different comment for each one, but you can certainly lump all those together. If you would like to do old school style, you can write out your comments, type them out on your typewriter or by hand or whatever you want, and you can mail those direct to Cayenne, who's on the meeting tonight. You can mail those in. Those will be given the same consideration. The important thing to note there is the December 15th is the deadline. So we have just over a week left to go for public comments. And we'll be putting out another note kind of to the state tomorrow to make sure everybody realizes we're nearing the end of that public comment period. And lastly, on that page, you can see the members of the Planning Advisory Committee, what we call the PAC. Those members and their affiliations are there. At least one of them, Jane, is here with us tonight, Jane Kohlmeyer from Helena. And there may be others as well, but I know Jane's here. And a little bit on the timeline and some more information if you have to get a hold of me directly or any of the others. So that covers, I guess, the comment. Just want to stress, the more you can include in your comments, the better, the more details and your thoughts about why you like it or why you don't like it. In addition, comment about the alternatives or anything. This is your chance to really be heard as they get ready to make decisions on the EA. So I will I'll stop sharing my screen and turn this back over. Ask Cayenne to start sharing her screen again. We'll jump back to her and she can take over from here.
Great. Well, thank you everybody so much again for joining us today. We're really thrilled that we have your engagement in this really important planning process. My name is Cayenne Bishop and I serve as the Parks and Outdoor Recreation Planner. And so I am working with a team of individuals on looking at some of the modifications and management issues that are key to making sure that the Smith River and the corridor itself are pristine and healthy for future generations to come. I wanted to just spend a little time today before we jump into things to just walk you through a little bit how we intend to use our time. And so you're going to hear a little bit about the planning process from me, and then Cullen Moss, my colleague, also the park manager for the Smith River, is going to walk you through the various management topics that we are trying to address with the environmental assessment, otherwise known as the EA, that we have put forth. We're gonna maybe spend about 30 minutes to kind of share that information with you. And then we've allotted about 45 minutes for an opportunity for you to ask questions. I will say that just as Gary referenced, there has really been a whole team of people involved in putting this together. You're seeing me, you've heard now from Dave and Gary, and you'll hear from Cullen, but behind the scenes is probably, you can imagine, this is a pretty significant effort internally, as well as discussions that we've been privileged to have with a number of experts and key stakeholders. So there are really three key things that have happened that have gotten us to where we are today. That is, we've issued this draft EA. We are now at the point of trying to collect your feedback and your comments on our ideas. And maybe the first thing that I would offer is that in that EA, just as with others, what we've tried to do is set forth some ideas, some concepts. There's still a number of details that we need to work out, and we recognize that. And some of you I know who've provided comments already have offered us some excellent ideas and further things that we might think about. So that's kind of what has happened. But where we started was really looking at the 2009 management plan. And so, you know, that plan is 12 years old, and it's, I think, served the public and the agency very well. But just as we are doing with a lot of the managed lands that we operate for FWP, we recognize that across the state and really across the country in many dimensions, outdoor recreation is growing and it is changing. And the way that people are interacting with the outdoors looks a lot different than it did back in 2009. So we really tried to do a very introspective look at the management plan itself, as well as related rules, statutes, policies, and just trying to think about what are some of those key things that for us offer potentially the most concern in terms of trying to uphold our mission of protecting and conserving this really important resource. I love, as I've reviewed the comments, how many times the word treasured resource has come up in people's feedback. And that is truly what it is. There's a lot of passion both in the agency and outside in terms of making sure that this is a place that many, many generations to come can enjoy. So, you know, we did this review, we identified some topics, and, you know, this is probably something that is going to be an iterative process in that I think that we'll be looking in the future as well, potentially to look at additional issues. So this is really kind of our first stab at looking at some of the issues that we've recognized are priorities or through conversations with others have identified in terms of things that we might consider changing. And, you know, the third thing that happened is that we organized, you've already heard this group referenced, the Planning Advisory Committee for the Smith River. And what is the Planning Advisory Committee? This is a group of diverse individuals, some who participated in our former Smith River Advisory Council, but others who also are offering us different perspectives as well as we think about the key issues and how we might approach them from kind of a management and operational standpoint. And so what we've tried to do here is include some new voices. We've also been very deliberate in trying to make sure that some of the key stakeholder groups, outfitters, landowners, and others have been represented on this group. And, really this group has been terrific for us. It has offered us a sounding board as we've worked through our review of various issues and thought about kind of how we might prioritize some of those things. I know that we have one of our PAC members with us, Jane Kohlmeyer, who may not be a stranger to many of you. She formerly was a forest supervisor. And so Jane, I just wanted to give you the chance, if you would like to offer up a few things for the public to understand the role of the PAC and maybe even some of the discussions that we've had as part of this planning process. Jane, are you there?
Yes. Can you see me? Because I stopped my video. Yep. Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, as Kyan said, we had a very diverse group of folks, and they came from across the state of Montana, representing different aspects and users of the river. I'd say that all the folks were extremely committed to kind of maintaining the Smith River so it continues to be a special experience for future users. The PAC, we worked for 3 days, over 3 months, and we worked with FWP staff to help flesh out the 4 topics that are in the draft EA. We all often had very vigorous discussions. Everyone is very committed and wanting to have the Smith be a special place, but also aware of just the kind of sometimes the tension there is between trying to protect the resource and the users and the people wanting to get on the Smith. And Colin will talk about this more later, but from 2020 to 2021, there was a 50% increase in applications for the Smith River. And I just think that's indicative of the popularity of the river, but it also is indicative of that. I think there's going to be continue to be increased use and demand to get on the river, and maybe there'll be larger party sizes, and all of these issues are being addressed in the 4 topics that'll be discussed later. And I also just want to give kudos to the FWP staff. They've been really good at listening to the diversity of the opinions and trying to bring it all in to develop a draft plan for a really special place in the state. Thank you.
Great. Jane, thank you so much, both for your contributions this evening, as well as your participation in all of the meetings. Before I move on, I also wanted to offer up to my friend and colleague, Quinn Kuka, a component of this planning process, which is not just critical for this particular effort, but for planning processes that we are addressing throughout the state. And that is reaching out to tribes and making sure that their perspectives and their views are also represented. Quinn, are you there? And would you like to offer up any comments on your work?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you, Kyan. I am the tribal liaison for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and it's my duty to put the 2 governments together at the same table. And in this case, I've reached out to multiple tribes throughout the state, and some even out of state, that have some historic presence on the landscape. And we want to preserve their memories, their ancestors, any kind of archaeological item that might be found, and not only from the federal and state processes that our staff goes through, but just to have them at the table and their voices be heard, and then they can remove themselves as necessary. So we're working with over 13 tribes right now in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Quinn. Your role is so critical to us as we look across, again, all of our various planning processes and try to be as inclusive and respectful about the recreation and how we're managing these lands. So I've spent a little time to talk through what we're going to do this evening, some of the work that has been undertaken in recent months. And now I just wanted to create a little bit of a path forward to give everybody a sense of kind of what the kind of roadmap for our work looks like. First, I would love to just reinforce that this public comment period, just as others that we undertake for our planning process, is absolutely instrumental to the work that we do. Your feedback is taken very, very critically into all of the different aspects of these planning efforts. And as many of you maybe even have acknowledged in some of your comments, this is not an easy task. There are not necessarily easy decisions to be made. And as you just heard, we are also trying to weigh a number of perspectives. So I just want to both thank everybody who might be on the call and in this session who've already submitted comments. You've been already very thoughtful. And obviously the time that you have taken is just, it shows through. This has been really a rewarding experience. And I know that every time we go through these, we learn a lot more about our own work and have different opportunities to kind of think about the issues. So just want to say that we are really in kind of the nuts and bolts of a lot of the planning period. That said, again, as I mentioned, the EA offers ideas. And so there's still a number of details to flesh out. Once we have taken all these comments into consideration, what our plan is to gather the PAC group together once again, share kind of what we heard, any ways that we directionally may shift a little bit, modulate certain things, do more of other things. We're going to bring them together to again serve as our sounding board. And then after that, we will issue a final decision notice. So in other words, they're going to have another chance to weigh in both with respect to the EA and then the management plan update. As some of you who may be familiar with some of these processes know, there potentially is some space here for the need to look at administrative rulemaking. And so I wanted to turn the conversation over to my co-planning facilitator, Charlie Sperry, who is going to talk through a little bit about kind of what that really means. You know, I know that some of you may look at this and think, wow, it's just a lot of bureaucrats sitting in a room trying to throw darts at a board, and it is not that at all. We have tried to make this process as inclusive as possible and are now also kind of looking at these really important aspects that we also need to address. So Charlie, if you're there, I wonder if you could just take a few minutes to share some of your views.
You bet. Thanks, Kyan. And good evening. Excuse me. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, this is I'm going to be pretty brief here. The slide, in essence, points out what I'll mention, that right now we're working on the environmental assessment for the plan. That sets the broad direction going forward. There's a reasonable chance that the final decision notice will, in essence, need some additional rulemaking to implement the actions. If that is the case, then we'll be going through a second process with the Parks and Recreation Board. They are the authority for rulemaking for fish, wildlife, and parks, the Smith River specifically. That would likely take place during the coming calendar year, 2022. And then whatever comes from rulemaking then would be in place so that we could implement those new rules for the float season of 2023. So in a nutshell, there is another public process that's scheduled for 2022. You might see some things coming out of the plan that don't require rulemaking that could be a part of this coming float season, but most of the substantial changes that are being considered in the EA would require some type of rulemaking exercise next year. So that's why we wouldn't be actually implementing those changes until the following float season. Thanks, Kyan.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. So you've heard from a few of us. That said, I just want to also share with you this is a list of the village that it has required in terms of getting to the point that we are with our environmental assessment for the Smith. We have a number of course, subject matter experts. We have certain members of leadership within FWP. And importantly, we also have participation and partnership with our good friends over at the Forest Service, because of course, as many of you are aware, there are adjacent properties as part of the Helena, Lewis, and Clark forests that also are implicated in a number of these different issues. And I know that Bobby and Carol, you're both here. I don't know, I just want to give you a little bit of window of time too, if there's anything that you would like to add at this point.
Hi, everyone. So thanks, Cayenne. Yeah, no, I just want to briefly say we definitely have a stake in the Smith River and are enjoying being partners with the state on this. And we work side by side to make sure that we can do everything possible for the public's experience in floating the river. And, you'll hear from Colin tonight on several issues that we're experiencing. We'll be in partnership with them to help move this EA forward. That I will be quiet so that we can move on. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Carol. It's been wonderful to work with you both. Well, great. At this point, I think what I'm going to do is turn it over to my colleague, Cullen Moss. He is no stranger to many of you. Often, I think he is regarded as the face and the voice of the Smith. And he's going to provide a brief presentation to talk about some of the things that we've been doing in this planning process, and specifically how we arrived at addressing the management issues at hand. So Cullen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Cayenne. Can you guys see me? You can, okay, good. Yeah, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for attending this evening. As was mentioned, this is our second of two webinars to discuss our environmental assessment for the Smith River Management Plan update. And so what are we doing and why? Well, I think you've heard it, a lot of it already. You know, we're seeking input on an environmental assessment, or an EA for short, that considers potential updates to the 2009 Smith River Management or State Park and River Corridor or Recreation Management Plan. And as Cayenne had mentioned earlier, you know, our current plan is 12 years old. It was adopted in 2009. And when we started that process, we started that in 2007, and we did that all internally also. You know, we didn't hire any outside contractors to help us with that plan. And it was a 2-year process. We had a committee similar to the committee that we have now, our PAC committee that we're using for this update. And I think we had 11 or 12 meetings with that group, and we pretty much overhauled the old 1997 management plan. So at that point, we knew that plan was fairly old, it was fairly dated. So we went through pretty much an overhaul. And so, you know, the current plan that we're operating under now, the 2009 plan, a lot of the direction that is provided in there is very relevant to today. However, we did recognize that, you know, as Cayenne had mentioned, as time goes on, things change, circumstances change, visitor use patterns change. We did recognize that, yeah, we do have some issues that we really do need to take another look at, short of doing a complete overhaul and reinventing the wheel. So that's what we basically did. So as Gary had mentioned, you know, we identified 4 issues in the current management plan that we felt were priorities, and we developed alternatives, including a preferred alternative for those. Growing interest in use. You know, looking at statistics way back to 1991 is when the Smith River first became a permitted river. You'll see this trend of not just only increasing interest in obtaining a permit to float the Smith, but also in turn, growing use to float. So what you're looking at on this slide and that graph there, that line graph, is 10 years worth of data from 2011 to 2020. And those little black diamonds, if you can see them, you know, those have the number of floaters for those particular years that are down on the horizontal axis. And then you'll notice kind of a black dotted line, and that's a trend line. So that's kind of helpful to what that tells you is what the trend is. Is the trend flat? Is it trending downward? Is it trending upward? Well, in this case, obviously, it's trending upward. So basically, the steeper the slope of that trend line, the greater the increase in the use. People will often ask, well, what are some of the factors that are contributing to this increase in use? The Smith River, I realize it's limited to 9 launches per day, 15 people per group. Probably the single biggest factor in the increase in use is the average group size for private floaters. And particularly for the past 5 years, 2017 to 2020, we really saw a marked increase in that average group size for private floaters. And during the 10-year span of 2011 to 2020, that increase was right around between 1.4 and 1.5 people per group more than it was 10 years previous. And that may not sound like a lot. It's like, well, it's only 1.5 people per group. But when you kind of look at the big picture and over the course of a season, that adds up really fast. For example, on any given day, that could mean anywhere between 9 and 13 more people launching on the Smith River per day. And over the course of the season, that'll tend to add up. So again, just the growing interest in obtaining a permit, as well as the increase in use, we are having noticeable effects on the resource itself, natural and potentially cultural resource impacts. And this increase in use is pretty much directly related to the 4 issues that I'll discuss this evening. Next slide. Thank you. So as was mentioned earlier, the 2021 draft environmental assessment for the management plan update is available for public comment. At the bottom of each one of these screens, you'll see where you can submit your comments, and Dave walked us through that earlier this evening on how you can do that. There again, there's the 4 issues. Gary had mentioned those. So they are management of Camp Baker, human waste management, natural and cultural resource impacts, and floater opportunities. And if you haven't already had a chance to take a look at the EA, the way it's kind of set up once you get into the actual issue section of the EA is there will be a discussion, typically a few paragraphs discussing the issue, why it's an issue, some statistics that talk about the issue. And then the next part of that, we'll talk about, okay, well, there's the issue. What are the current conditions? And then below that, we'll have a paragraph that describes the desired conditions, which we'll see on the screens this evening also. And then kind of the meat of any environmental assessment is the evaluation of the preferred impact, the impacts of the preferred alternative to both the physical environment and the human environment. Next slide. So the first issue, again, management of Camp Baker. What you see in this photograph, that is obviously a view of the Camp Baker put in. And I believe I took this photo mid to late May, either 2018 or 2019. And this is a pretty typical scene you'll see in the mornings at Camp Baker. In the kind of the center of the screen, you'll see kind of the tent city with people mulling around in vehicles and trailers. Off to the right of that photograph across the road is another small little grassy area where people will camp. Really just kind of a dispersed camping situation with fire rings and picnic tables and people just kind of finding a spot where they can fit in and set up shop. And then in the foreground of the photograph, that was historically and still is our main parking area for vehicles and trailers. So, as you can kind of see here as the years have gone on, you could probably switch to the next slide, Cayenne, is, 20, 25 years ago, with the amount of use that we had, the much smaller numbers of people overnight camping, Camp Baker pretty much could handle that amount of use that was occurring for both, the day use and the overnight camping. But one thing we've really noticed as the years have gone on is that, it's becoming a little more crowded and congested, it seems like every year. And it's becoming more and more difficult and challenging to try to manage for both, the day use, meaning the staging, the preparing to get ready to launch and the actual launching, along with overnight camping. And a big part of the issue is Camp Baker is it's a small site, a real small footprint. And so we're really trying to pack in a lot of two different types of use in a very small area. And so due to that fact, we have seen also some fairly severe resource impacts at Camp Baker. It was really never designed properly for the flow of traffic for day use and for overnight camping. There weren't a whole lot of really any types of barriers put in to restrict where people can drive and not drive. And so as a result, we've seen some fairly significant resource impacts. Basically, with that said, our preferred or our desired conditions for Camp Baker would be to manage Camp Baker to best accommodate floaters and provide for the safe and efficient flow of traffic through the site, while also protecting the important natural and cultural resources at Camp Baker. Next slide. So with that said, and I'll try to keep this short because I'm a little bit short on time. We got started a little bit late, and I want to leave enough time for comments. So our preferred alternative, I won't read the other alternatives. I'll just go to the preferred for this evening, is to manage Camp Baker for day use only and continue to register groups and assign camps via phone and online. And with that said, we did that the last couple of years. Is most of you on this call probably know, we made Camp Baker a day use in the early spring of 2020 when COVID-19 hit us. And part of that was we were trying to figure out as an agency, with respect to also trying to stay within social distancing requirements. How can we salvage a season? How can we have a float season when we have so many people kind of crammed into such a small area at Camp Baker? And so what ended up happening is we did postpone the season. So we closed the river to floating. We were actually closed from April 1 through May 4th. But during that time period, we decided, well, let's see if we can come up with a contingency plan to salvage our float season. So that's exactly what we did. We came up with a plan to make Camp Baker day use only. We registered groups via phone using a random number generator to tell us the order that we would call people. We set up a 2.5-hour time in every afternoon, and we called each permit holder, including the commercial outfitters, 2 days prior to their launch date. And then when the floaters would arrive, they'd be all registered, they'd be prepaid, they'd have their boat camps already done over the phone, and we would just the rangers would simply hand them a Ziploc packet with other materials in it, including their boat tags, some maps, their floater log, a copy of the registration form along with the receipt. And then all that was left to do with each group was basically the rangers would give them the floater orientation, leave no trace, safety, rules and regulations orientation. And then when one of the 2 boat launches was available, they would set up somewhere in the grassy island or just on the other side of the road, stage, try to social distance the best they could, and then when one of the boat launches was available, then they could proceed to the boat launch and launch. And so lo and behold, it was kind of a living experiment. What we found is that, wow, this actually worked pretty well. And to be honest, we had been discussing this internally, prior to COVID hitting, that man, Camp Baker, it's really starting to it's showing us wear and tear. We're having a lot of resource impacts. It's getting really crowded. People are responding to that crowded question on the floater log at Camp Baker more and more. Their experience level is decreasing. And then when COVID hit and we were forced to go to day use only, it really showed us that, hey, this worked pretty darn good. It was really efficient for my staff, my river rangers. We got a lot of good comments from the public and all 7 of the commercial outfitters. We had a lot of good comments from the local community of White Sulphur Springs, business community, business leaders, the Moore County commissioners all supported it, as well as a couple of the adjacent landowners. So that's one of the main reasons why we're looking at making this our preferred alternative. And that was the next question is, well, why is this your preferred? For all the things I just mentioned, natural cultural resource, protection of those resources, improved experience, less crowding, less congestion. It was very well received. I will make a note, and we did evaluate this in the EA, is that when we made the decision to close Camp Baker at overnight camping, we did realize that, yeah, we're going to have some displacement going on here. In other words, meaning that, people that historically like to camp at Camp Baker, to use that as kind of their first night to kind of meet and greet with family and friends and swap stories and who's bringing what and who's got the steaks and who's got the cooler with the beer, that, we would have displacement possibly for people that wanted to camp on other public lands in the area. And so we recognize that, that did occur. Most of it occurred on our sites at both the Fort Logan fishing access site and the Newland Creek Reservoir fishing access site. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Next slide. Next issue, human waste management. It was somewhere when I did my research several years ago, it was either on or right around 1983 when Fish, Wildlife and Parks and our partners, the Helen and Lewis and Clark National Forest, began digging these pit latrines. So it's been about 38, 39 years, right on that time range. And during that time period, again, from my research going back and looking at old ranger logs and annual reports, we've likely dug at least 1,200 pits over that 38, 39 year time period. And so on average, I think right now, the past few years, we're averaging about 36, 37 pit toilets per year that we end up digging. Probably the biggest issue with, the pit latrines are probably the sheer impacts that we're causing to the soil and the vegetation. When we're, every year the cumulative impacts of that, especially when we're digging in different locations, and oftentimes we have to, that has a huge impact. And you can only imagine the problem, the cubic feet of soil that is being displaced on any given year. And the other part of it too is, and Kyan, you could probably switch to the next slide, is we're literally in several of our camps running out of physical locations to locate these pit latrines. And a lot of it has to do with just the sheer topography of the Smith River, where, several years ago, about well over 20 years ago, we were required, DEQ required the department to remove some of our pit toilets that were actually in the 50-year floodplain up and out of that 50-year, 100-year floodplain up to higher ground. And so in some of our camps, we're up in fairly steep, rocky terrain, timber terrain, where we don't have a whole lot of flat surfaces to actually locate pit latrines. But then we're also limited just by the sheer fact that we'll dig 6-8 inches down, and that's all there is for soil. And then we're hitting sheer rock, and not just rocks, oftentimes almost like bedrock portions of the limestone in that corridor. And so sometimes we end up, we're going to have to try digging in an old hole. Sometimes we know it's an old hole. Sometimes we don't necessarily know it's an old hole. And more often than not, what happens is we get a few inches down, and then we realize that, boy, this is not completely decomposed, and we have to stop digging, rebury that, and try a new location. So, and then there's other things, the time and labor it takes, potential health issues. So with this issue, our desired condition is simply that, we'll try to manage human waste disposal on the river with a long-term stewardship approach that's guided by some principles. And a few of these principles, again, reiterating some of the things I mentioned earlier: reducing the impacts and disturbance to the soil, the vegetation, cultural resources, potential contamination of water resources, the risk to public health, not only just the public, but also to staff that has to maintain these toilets. And then also to help minimize the effects of any other system we may institute to the floating public and our adjacent landowners. Next slide. So with that, again, our preferred alternative B, would be to implement a mandatory human waste pack out using self-contained toilet systems with disposal at or near the Eden Bridge takeout. Again, why is that our preferred alternative? Just for the things I mentioned: the resource impacts, health and sanitation, time and labor. And really, I believe we are probably the last river in the United States, or at least the Western United States, or the lower 48 anyway, that still continue to utilize pit latrines at 100% basis. And really the industry standard, and this is nothing new. Human waste pack out has been a a method on many rivers for actually several decades now. And so it's not a new thing. There are many products on the market, everything from expensive stainless steel groovers, if that was the direction we decided to go, for example, to 5-gallon plastic buckets that would have a sealable lid on them, to there's bag systems out there. So the technology is there. Next slide. Natural and cultural resource impacts. Just real briefly, the photographs you're looking at on this slide, the one on the left, that's Middle Table Rock Boat Camp. That's located at about river mile 33.5. On river right, this is looking upstream at the camp. And what this photograph is really illuminating is some of the impacts that we have to our boat camp landing. So you'll see some sloughing of the banks, some erosion, loss of vegetative cover, really no vegetation, including any kind of willows to kind of stabilize that bank. The photograph on the right, that one is intended to kind of show what it often looks like or can be like in the early spring season, typically in the months of April and late March. And we'll often encounter conditions where, the ground is still semi-frozen. We'll have standing water in some of the boat camps. Obviously, the vegetation hasn't greened up and taken root yet. We'll often have snow and ice still standing in the camps. So this is a very vulnerable time of year where those impacts that foot traffic and trampling can cause can really be exacerbated. And in this instance here, this was an ice flow. This is at, I believe that's Upper Trout Creek Boat Camp. And that was an ice flow that pretty much wiped out our boat camp sign and our tie-off post. So the Rangers are replacing those in that photo. Okay, again, with natural and cultural resource impacts, as the years have gone on, we're seeing more and more of these impacts, not only in the boat camp landings, like you saw in that earlier photo, but definitely within the boat camps proper themselves. Well, what are some of these impacts? Again, sloughing and eroded riverbanks, loss of vegetative cover, soil erosion, soil compaction, tree root exposure, and then loss and or damage to some of our cultural resources. There are some things that we can do now, and we have started implementing some of these practices that do not require rulemaking, and what we call these are recreation ecology measures. And some examples of these measures include site hardening. Site hardening is just simply bringing in some sort of materials like gravel or wood chips to kind of help harden the site and stabilize it a little bit, so you're not having the mud in the compaction, and you may have better drainage and try to reduce erosion, those types of things. Constructing rock steps at some of the landings, we started doing that the last few years with the intent of trying to funnel traffic into specific areas rather than having people just, over 100 or 150 foot stretch of riverbank up and down those riverbanks, just trying to focus the impacts in the traffic in specific areas, and then try to build those paths and those rock steps to be sustainable long term. Other methods you can do are defining boundaries, like defining the core kitchen and cooking area to kind of concentrate your impacts, maybe defining the tent sites or the tent pads, and maybe hardening those or putting some materials down for tent pads, maybe even defining the actual perimeter of the camp, because what happens oftentimes is those campsites, the loss of vegetative cover will kind of creep and grow, and we call that pioneering, where people will pioneer new tent sites. And 10 years ago, this site was maybe a nice flat grassy area to pitch a tent, and 10 years later, it's kind of a mud hole. So then somebody moves to another nice grassy area, and then you kind of get that cumulative growth of those sites. Some other things we can do are either active or passive revegetation. And oftentimes, if we would institute some of those measures, that would require another tool called rest rotation, where if we decide, okay, here's a management prescription for this specific site, we think we need to go in and re-veg it. We're probably going to need to close it for a certain period of time, either just maybe a short time in the spring, or maybe for the whole season, or maybe for a couple seasons. That's kind of what we would call resting and maybe rotating, but definitely resting sites. So with that said, these recreation ecology measures, they can work, but they do require a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, and they can take some time. And we've recognized that. So These likely will not completely mitigate all the impacts that we're seeing in the corridor. So likely there would be some additional management actions that may need to be implemented. And these management actions, these would be things that would then likely require some rulemaking. And typically most recreation resource managers will start out with management actions that are less restrictive in nature and try those first. And if they're measuring what the standard is for that management prescription and they're finding that they're not meeting that standard, then they can use what's another tool called adaptive management, which allows them the ability to have the flexibility to say, well, this least restrictive management action in combination with this ecology measure aren't quite getting us to our standard that we're trying to reach. And those standards would have to be measurable in any management prescription. And so then they can kind of change it up a little bit, say, well, maybe we'll go to a moderately restrictive management action, and we'll add another recreation ecology measure, for example. And so that would be an example of adaptive management. So what is our desired condition for natural and cultural resource impacts? We would manage those natural and cultural resource conditions at the boat camps and the boat landings that make sure that they're consistent with the direction that is provided to us in what's called the Smith River Management Act that calls for FWP to protect the integrity of the river's water and canyon resources for future generations. So next slide, please. So there again, our preferred alternative there at the bottom, alternative E would be, again, this is kind of right now, just an idea, as it was mentioned earlier, one of our many ideas for preferred alternatives, but and kind of a suite of different things. But one of them could be, create a system of incentives to promote smaller group sizes throughout the season, close the river to floating for a given period of time during the early spring season, and reallocate only a portion of canceled permits during the peak season. And it's probably important to note that, again, with all these alternatives, including the preferred alternative, with the exception of the no action, we would also implement one or more of those recreation ecology measures that I mentioned a while ago. Next slide. Last but not least is floater opportunities. Next slide. This graph that you're seeing here is representative of, this is the number of applications we received per year between the years of 2009 and 2021. During the past 4 years, our permit applications have increased by about 146%, and over the past 10 years, or excuse me, the past 13 years, 146%, excuse me, but during the past 10 years, and about nearly 166% during the past 13 years. And then in 2021, you can kind of see that we had a spike. We went from 10,866 applicants in 2020 all the way up to 15,160. I believe that was right around a 33 or 34% increase, and that was our biggest jump we've ever had. And so, simply put, the odds to draw a permit keep decreasing. I heard this from our public 10, 15 years ago when we had about a third of the applications we have now. That, gosh, Colin, it's getting harder and harder for the average Joe to draw a permit, and I've been trying for years and I'm just unsuccessful. So our desired condition for floater opportunities is simply to try to provide individuals who've been unsuccessful at drawing a permit and or who have not recently floated the river to have additional opportunities to either acquire a permit or float as part of another person's permit. Next slide. So simply, there again, our preferred alternative would be we would try to explore a development of some type of system to increase floater opportunities for unsuccessful permit applicants and others who have not recently or ever floated the Smith River. Why is that our preferred? Again, simply, it's becoming just really, really difficult to draw a permit on the Smith River. With that, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Cayenne.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin. I know that is a lot of information to try to convey in a short period of time, but I think you were pretty successful once again. I do want to offer up a window here to any of our FWP colleagues, any of our Planning Advisory Committee members, or colleagues at the U.S. Forest Service. Is there anything else that you would like to add or reinforce before we head into our Q&A session? Okay, well, I hear silence, and so we'll certainly allot a little bit more time in order to do that as we move forward. So as we move into the Q&A session, just wanted to offer up a few tips. So please let us help kind of moderate this session and do it fairly by staying consistent to some of these guidelines that we're hoping to put in front of you. And so first of all, Dave Hagengruber has already walked through the way that you, if again, you're not familiar, can raise your hand if you're on the phone. And you can do that by dialing *9 and then unmuting with *6. And of course, if you are joining us online, you can simply do that by raising your hand using that raise your hand function and then unmuting yourself. Before you get into your question, we would just love to know who you are and where you're calling from. It would also be helpful if any of you are representing some entity or organization, just so we kind of know who we're speaking with. Please be concise. I know that there are a number of you here, and we know that we're all here because we're passionate about this really important resource. And so just want to hopefully inspire you to be really clear with your questions. This again is not a time for public comment. We've already kind of reviewed that. And we are going to be very vigilant in making sure that we don't get questions that are disguised as comments. I think we tried to do that last time and we're pretty successful. So in order to facilitate this part of our evening, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Linnea Shore, who will then kind of look for any hands up that we have and then go ahead and pose your question. So Linnea, if you're there, I'll turn it over to you.
Yep, I'm here. Hello. So yeah, question and answer time is open. If you have a question, observation, just anything you'd like to share with the group, that's again not an official comment. Please, we're ready.
And Linnea, I would, for those that are participating here, we really want to get some participation from the public because we want to make sure we are providing the information that's needed to the public so that they can provide, comments that are relevant and that we can act on. So if you're on there, no questions are irrelevant here, and I hope that our public will join and ask some questions.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, let me second what he just said. No question is too big or too small. We just really like to hear from our attendees. Mike is being brave. Thank you, Mike Burr. You are able to talk, but you still need to unmute on your end.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I hope my reputation isn't bad. If you know me that well, I've never met any of you. I actually have 3 or 4 questions. Have you at this time identified and gotten access to a SCAT machine for waste disposal?
I can answer that question. Good evening, Mike. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for raising your question. I was going to mention sometimes you have to move your cursor down towards the bottom of the screen to get your raise hand and some of those tools to pop up, and I forget that myself sometimes. Well, Mike, and I believe we do have our design and construction engineer, Randy Rognally, on the call with us tonight also. We have been doing some research on scat machines. A couple of years ago, my supervisor and I, we actually called the gentleman who lives in Oregon who actually manufactures, builds and sells those scat machines. For those of you who don't know, a scat machine is what's used on some other Western rivers, a few in Idaho and some other states, that it's basically like a large industrialized dishwasher. And if river systems that require or allow the use of what's called a groover, which is a hard-sided container to pack out their human waste, it's basically washes and sanitizes your groover either at the takeout or some other location. So we have been researching that, Mike, the ins and outs and the details and the cost and locations and where we can locate it and do we have, can we use, is a drain field appropriate, or do we need to use some sort of holding tanks, and what the cost would be. So yeah, we have done some legwork on that, Mike.
Thanks. Second question, why aren't fire rings going to be removed and fire pans required? It's kind of a simultaneous thing in most boaters' minds that you would haul both. And to me, that would help a lot with the vegetation issue around a lot of those camps.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. We considered that a little bit. We talked a little bit about that, but when we were kind of trying to prioritize our issues for this EA, I think we were thinking, let's not bite off a little more than we can chew. We're probably going to have our hands full just with the 4 issues that we have. And so that's, that was one of the reasons we probably didn't go there. I think there's a few different schools of thought on the fire pans. And, I floated several rivers, the main salmon mainly, and the lower salmon in Idaho, where they are required. And of course, in those types of ecosystems where you're basically on sand, sheer sand, where the wind and water can change the layout and the geography of those sites, planting a fire ring in sand that's going to be buried and a week later from a windstorm isn't going to work. And so in those instances, yeah, it makes sense in that with the ashes getting into the sand, it's hard to clean up. On the Smith River, it's almost kind of like, the core kitchen areas where, when I talked earlier about the impacts that can occur from people pioneering sites with building or setting up their tent in newly undisturbed sites, and then after a few years, that site becomes denuded of vegetation. I think that, there's a school of thought that thinks that says that could potentially happen with fire pans, for example. If we allow people to kind of set up a fire pan where they would they may say, well, I don't like this spot that's kind of muddy and wet and just dirt. I want to set up my fire pan in this nice grassy area. And, the fire rings basically are kind of our kitchen and our living room combined in these boat camps, where there's a lot of activity, a lot of social time, and a lot of foot traffic. And so I think in some respects, keeping the fire rings where they're at, there again, it's kind of one of those management methods to try to secure those impacts to a specific small footprint. Does that make sense, Mike?
Certainly does. I don't know if I agree, but it certainly, as long as you're considering it,
sure.
I think that moving the kitchen around would reduce some wear with the groups. But third question, since it's questions and not comments, if you're going to reduce private opportunities, say early season, are you going to, and then also not do all the cancellations? Are you going to correspondingly, and we don't know the ratio of commercial to private, are you going to, overall in the boater statistics, are you going to also correspondingly reduce some commercial opportunities and maybe replace some of those private opportunities that have been lost?
Well, there was a similar question at our Zoom meeting last week that had to do with commercial outfitters, and I believe Mike Valesky at that time had had commented on that. And Charlie Sperry, if you're still on, could I throw that over at you? I just want to make sure that we're consistent with from what we heard from last week's meeting on that issue.
Yeah, you bet, Colin. This is Charlie Sperry with the department. Yeah, the question last week was a little bit different, but it was along the lines of the incentives for smaller groups. And the question was whether that would apply to the outfitters. And so that in general, what for the voluntary components of the proposed EA plan, the voluntary pieces, that's a little bit different than if we actually get down to mandating, say, smaller group sizes at a given time of year. In that case, we likely would be looking at a restriction of sorts that applies to all user groups across the board, outfitted trips and private float trips. The other thing that Colin shared last week that I thought was interesting and specific to your question, the early season, the idea that with the resources being most vulnerable during the early part of the float season, that is a time of year when we don't typically see much in the way of commercial trips. So I don't know if we have any that occur that early in the season, but I think your question though is one that it's a part of a number of questions that as we go forward, particularly if we get down to, as I said, requirements, changes that would require certain actions, that we will be looking to do that equitably across the board and not just one user group. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I understand that, but I think knowing the ratio of commercial to private voters historically, and you have great records, would be great. But thanks for that answer. Final question, and somebody else can go from what I'm saying. Are you going to have a library for all the public comments? Are you going to have a way that people that have submitted prior to your final decision can go in and see what other thoughts other people have done? We're doing that currently up here on rewriting the Flathead River Plan. Is public comments are libraried, and if you want to go review them, you can.
I can probably tackle that one as well. Appreciate that question. We were just talking about that actually today, and one way or the other, at a minimum, we'll have a synopsis of analysis of all the public comments, and typically that's sorting them into themes topically and support or opposition and suggestions for doing things differently. So at a minimum, that will take place. The other opportunity we can explore is to have the raw comments, and that may very well be what we end up doing, that we would scrub the personal identification information off of those, of course, but you'd be able to actually see the written comments that have been submitted.
You guys do a great job. Thank you very much for working on this, and boy, public comment is so vital. So it's good. We're going to get some. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for those good questions, Mike. Do we have any other attendees who have a question they'd like to pose to our staff?
Linnea, I might jump in here really quick, if I could. As I've been reviewing the comments, I know that there have been several questions and ideas raised about the cancellation system. And I wondered, perhaps there are some folks on the line who either have experienced that, but maybe there are others who have not. And so, Colin, I wondered if you could just provide or just portray a little bit how that cancellation system works, just for the benefit of this audience, in case there are some who aren't really certain as to kind of what we're referring to. I know throughout this presentation, we've kind of touched on a number of technical terminology that some may be unfamiliar with.
Sure. And I believe there was a question at last week's meeting also. I think one gentleman asked if he'd heard a rumor if we're gonna get rid of our reservation phone system. And, you know, we really don't have a solid answer to that yet. The department's in the process of working with a company to develop what's called Explore Montana, or Explore MT for short, or XMT for short, which will replace our aging licensing system. And part of this update would also include the Smith River program. And you know, at this point, we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know exactly what its capabilities are going to be. But hopefully it will enhance the ability for not only the actual permit system and how people apply and how they draw, but also post-drawing, how we handle things like Kyan just mentioned, cancellations. And so for those of you who may not be familiar, the way we handle cancellations now, it's fairly antiquated. It's a phone call-in system. I have a reservation clerk who mans the one phone line 4 hours a day, 8 a.m. to noon, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, Mountain Time. And that's our sole source, with the exception of on weekends. Occasionally people can call the River Rangers account Baker to say, hey, I realize the clerk's out. Did you have any cancellations for today or for Sunday? But it's really, as far as customer service, it's really been difficult. You know, especially the first week or two when that reservation line opens, it's just flooded with hundreds of phone calls, and it's really hard to get through. And so we really do recognize that we need a better system that's much more user-friendly for our customers and the public, and even possibly our commercial outfitters may be able to utilize it too. But there again, as Gary had mentioned at the onset of the meeting, you know, a lot of these issues we still need to do a little homework on, to flush some ideas out, do some modeling, look at different ideas, what we think may or may not work. And that's just one of many.
Thank you, Colin. Any other questions from our attendees? Observations? Alternatives that you're glad to see being considered?
I think we have a rather shy group tonight, and that is fine. Hopefully that is some signal to us that we have been able to describe some of these really complex issues in a way that is understandable. And maybe you're already taking time now to provide us some comments. I'll just add one more thing here, and that is simply that in the review of comments, there were some questions about composting toilets. And so just pivoting back, Colin, to the human waste management topic, I wonder if you could just talk through some of the kind of perspective and analysis that has gone into looking at that as an option, and kind of how you and others in the region have been thinking about that.
Yeah, sure, Kyan. You know, when we updated the 2009 management plan, human waste was one of our issues during that planning process also. And my supervisor at the time and I did, you know, do some research into composting toilets, and they are used in some other rivers. The Deschutes River in northeastern Oregon, they have a few locations where they have composting toilets. And we pretty much ruled that out, partly, you know, due to the fact that, you know, they're big, they're bulky, they're expensive, and a lot of the sites we probably wouldn't be able to find locations for them to actually put them that would be up out of the floodplain and up and out of the danger of ice jams and ice wiping them out. And then also the fact that a good chunk of that canyon doesn't get a whole lot of direct sunlight and warmth, and it's fairly cold for a good portion of the year. And so most of those composting toilets, they require a fair amount of heat and light for them to actually compost properly and in a timely fashion. So there again, the fear is that they may not compost like they should, and they would fill up, and we wouldn't have a material that we could safely dispose of. And so those are just a few of the reasons, kind of similar to when we went through the process for human waste. You know, one of the comments we received was, why don't you put in just bear boxes? Well, kind of the same reason. Big, bulky, don't have a whole lot of room for them, very expensive, high maintenance. They could get wiped out by ice and trees falling on them. And so, and it was kind of the philosophy again of you know, trying to, you know, I guess, you know, try to get our public to be the stewards and do, you know, help us out rather than us always, you know, providing things for the public. And so it was for a variety of reasons that we decided, yeah, composting toilets are probably not the best solution to human waste management.
Thank you, Colin. Well, Cayenne, I'm still not seeing any hands.
Yeah, that's fine. Charlie or Gary, I know that there's been a number of conversations just around this planning process and these topics we've already talked about. You know, hopefully what we've done is at least hit the major contours of the things that we're looking at. Are there any topics, or even just in a more detailed way, aspects of the planning process that Gary, you or Charlie, you would like to reinforce or share with the group for their benefit?
Charlie, I'll let you go first.
I appreciate the thorough coverage from our staff. Really nice job, Colin, Cayenne, and others. I suspect the thoroughness is probably why we don't have a lot of questions at this point. But yeah, I think I would just reiterate that with the planning process, we're trying to set the guidelines, kind of the future direction for where we're going with the Smith. And as I noted earlier, there's many of the things we're considering doing would be a rulemaking effort to follow. So in both cases with this environmental assessment, nothing's decided yet. Everything's up for consideration at this point. That's why the comments are so critical. And then regarding some of the details, you know, the how we would go about implementing this direction, that would be forthcoming in the rulemaking process and ultimately a decision by our Parks and Recreation Board. So both of those processes emphasize the value in hearing from folks in the Planning Advisory Committee's role in all of this. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Charlie. Gary, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, you know, the only thing I would add is that, you know, the public process is what FWP honors, because the public is the resource that uses the Smith River. And we want to make sure that what we are doing in the end benefits both the resource and the public for the future.
Thank you. Well, we have a little bit of time left, but we can also give it back to folks. I know everybody's time is very valuable. Are there any additional questions before we hang up? All right. Well, I know that the Smith has gone by several. I love reading through the comments that we've received. It has been called a spectacular treasure, the experience of a lifetime, a quintessential part of Montana. And someone, I think, even referenced the Smith as being able to offer the most spectacular view from a honeypot one could ever ask for. And so, you know, I appreciate both the humor and also the seriousness, importantly, that everybody is lending to these planning processes. Thank you to those of you once again who have shared comments with us already. Gary, I might turn it over to you if we have no more questions to close us out for the evening.
Yeah, again, Cayenne, thank you. And thanks to our staff, advisory committee members that have come on and listened to this. This has been an amazing process from the standpoint of folks really diving in and looking at what the Smith River needs today. Again, I appreciate everybody that's participated in this from the public. If there are questions that that come on and arise after this, please don't hesitate to call Dave or Colin or myself in our Great Falls office, Cayenne and Helena, and we'll be able to answer those questions. Again, thanks a lot for participating, and the deadline is the 15th for public comments, and we're looking forward to getting as many of those as possible, so our conclusions reflect what the public really wants. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.